pleased to have everyone else here. The process is essentially going to be this. Mandy will give a presentation, which we expect will be excellent. After that, we will take questions from the broader audience, including all you folks back there. At that point, we will ask to end the streaming video. The committee will ask questions of Mandy. We will awkwardly send her out in the hall, decide her fate, and then bring her back in. So that will be the process. And with that, Mandy.
All right. Okay, so obviously I'm Mandy, and my presentation today is going to be on the research I've been doing for my thesis entitled Implicit Attitudes Towards Reproductively and Sexually Relevant Stimuli. Do female attitudes vary based on sexual orientation, conception risk, and hormonal contraceptive use? And I promise we will break that down. So, to give you just a little bit of background, the main thing that got me interested in this topic is something called the sexually relevant sensitivity hypothesis. So what does that mean? Basically, some research found that heterosexual females at high fertility were more sensitive to markers of maleness, while lesbian participants at high fertility were actually more sensitive to markers of femaleness. And so basically the conclusion that was drawn from these studies is that there's this possibility that females are actually more sensitive to cues of sexually relevant information as opposed to reproductively relevant information while they're at high fertility. And again, this is because we didn't see females across the board, regardless of sexual preference, automatically preferring the markers of maleness, which could be associated more heavily with the reproductive cues. So basically, again, my idea here is to look at really implicit attitudes. So I really want to look at the subconscious attitudes that are going on in females and how they perceive other females. So the best way to do this is to use something called the implicit association test, or the IAT. Basically what this is a measurement of the strength of a person's automatic association between mental representations of concepts and memory. So how this is done is basically you have a categorization task. You're given two concepts and an attribute. So a commonly used one is maybe the two concepts are flowers and bugs, and the attribute would be something like positive or negative attitudes. And basically what happens is when you combine the concept and the attribute, you start to look at the reaction time. So how long does it take an individual to combine the concepts of flower and good as opposed to flower and bad? And basically what you get from this is that a longer reaction time is considered to be some type of bias towards the concept. So I think really the easiest way to understand this, because it's kind of an abstract concept unless you really see it in practice, so I'm going to just briefly walk you through kind of what the participant does in an IAT. So the first thing they get is this screen with instructions. So what's going to end up happening is they're going to end up with stimuli presented in the middle of the screen, where right now we see the instructions, and they're going to have categories up at the top. So if the image or word or whatever form of stimuli that comes up belongs in the left-hand category, the participant is going to go ahead and press the E key. If it belongs to the right-hand category, they press the I key. So for instance, if this is the first image that comes up, this would be considered one of the trial blocks. You would, of course, categorize this as a pregnant female, so you would go ahead and select the E key to designate that that's the category it belongs to. Now let's say you made a mistake and actually said it was the I, meaning that it was the not pregnant category. What would happen then is you would get an X, and you'd actually have to go back and make sure that you do correctly answer the stimuli in the correct category. So the next stage of this, or the next block of trials, now looks at this based on the attribute. So again, we're wanting to look at positive and negative attitudes towards these concepts. So we're going to now do this with good or bad. And based on previous literature, I used the same words that have been used in most IAT studies. So for instance, the word nasty, that's going to belong to the bad category. So you would then, again, select that category. So now's where things get interesting. So the first two things are really just practice trials to kind of get the participant oriented. Now we're going to look at how participants respond when we have the concepts and the attributes combined together. So, for instance, here we have an image again of a pregnant female. So it's going to belong over here to this category. But now we also have this attribute of good included as well. So basically strong in their memory as perhaps another one would be. And again, we do the same thing with the words. So it might be harder for some participants while this goes into the right-hand category. It may take a slight longer time for them to associate the word nasty with not pregnant as opposed to maybe nasty with pregnant. So again, we're really trying to get at these subconscious emotions that are going on. So now that we've kind of given you an overview of how we're going to test this, let's look at the variables. So the first one I wanted to look at was really based on that previous research that looked at both lesbians and heterosexual women. So for sexual orientation, unfortunately, my sample only included heterosexual and bisexual participants. So I was unable to actually get any lesbian participants, and we'll kind of discuss why that partially happened in a bit with the limitations. Additionally, I wanted to look at conception risk. So I want to just take a second to explain why I'm using the term conception risk, which is kind of, not the easiest term to understand when you could just say something like fertile or ovulating. And the real reason is that this was an online study, and so our means of calculating where a woman was in her ovulatory stage was basically pretty crude. And it's actually the methodology that's used in most of the research today, which is really kind of a problem in the field. So basically, instead of saying that a woman is in her fertile state, all I can do is estimate. So conception risk is really just an overly cautious term to kind of reemphasize the fact that we're not actually sure that we're measuring a woman who's in her fertile state. So the first thing I wanted to look at is just naturally cycling women. So whether they were in a low conception risk or a high conception risk. So to explain how they got into these two groups, basically a woman in her high conception risk phase is going to be any woman who's in her fertile window. So her fertile window refers to usually about a 6-day span during her ovulatory cycle, where she's fertile, and it generally ends on or around the day of ovulation. And so for the low conception risk, I just actually included everyone who wasn't in that fertile window. And we can talk about this more in the future directions and whatnot, but for the purpose of this study, I really just wanted to kind of see, is there a difference between these two groups? So you can break up low conception risk into a lot of other categories, so menstruating, pre-ovulation, post-ovulation, and those are all things I would love to do in future studies. But for now, I just wanted to simplify it for the thesis, and so that's what I went with. So this is, again, traditionally how things are looked at, but I was also really interested in how do hormonal contraceptive users play in here. So I did one run analysis where we just looked at the naturally cycling women, so that's them right there. But I also ran another where I threw in another level of hormonal contraceptive users to see if they in any way differed from the naturally cycling women in different phases. And then again, also to kind of isolate these variables out so we made sure that we weren't missing any effects. I also looked at just whether or not women who were currently taking hormonal contraceptives and those naturally cycling had differences as well. And then finally, the dependent variables that I looked at were from that IAT that we were just talking about. So these are the implicit attitudes towards the stimuli. So the first one's going to look at that question of reproductively relevant information. So do females have different or positive or negative attitudes towards pregnant or not pregnant stimuli? And then the second is going to look at that sexual relevance. So do their attitudes differ based on whether the stimuli is sexy or not sexy? And so from this, I have 3 hypotheses. The first is that women who identify as heterosexual and are currently in a high conception risk phase will have the most positive attitudes towards the images of the pregnant targets. Now again, ideally, I have to point out that this was meant to be a comparison between heterosexual and strictly lesbian participants. Again, given the limitations of the sample, I then had to compare to bisexual women, which isn't quite the hypothesis I had, but we went with it anyways. The second one is really looking at this idea of sexual relevance. So women who identify as bisexual, and again, ideally it would have been lesbian females, but and the ones that are currently in a high conception risk phase will have the most positive ratings for the images of the sexy targets. And finally, kind of looking at hormonal contraceptive use, since inherently women who are on hormonal contraceptives are in a low conception risk phase because hormonal contraceptives prevent ovulation, I predicted that you would therefore see a similarity between hormonal contraceptive users and women in a low conception risk phase, as opposed to women in a high conception risk phase who I kind of predicted were going to be doing their own thing, which they were. So now I'll introduce you to our sample. We ended up with 70 females. Mean age is pretty much what you would expect. We ended up with a little more variability in the age range because not only did we recruit participants from SUNY New Paltz, but also Facebook as well. And to give you just a little idea of the breakdown, so for hormonal contraceptive use, we actually had a pretty reasonable distribution in the sample, so 40-60 with more women naturally cycling. However, this is not what we find with our other variables. So for conception risk phase, this is only looking at the naturally cycling females, and a vast majority of them were in the low conception risk phase. So again, over 83% compared to 17%. And this makes sense. Because again, in order to be in that high conception risk phase, you had to be in that 6-day window and taking the IAT on that day. And just as probability goes, there's going to be more people that aren't taking it on that day. So future research really could probably look at maybe identifying women and then trying to have them take it while they're in the particular phase, and not just kind of hoping that you'll find some. And then again with sexual orientation, actually a pretty similar distribution to the conception risk phase, where we have just a lot more heterosexual participants than bisexual, although I do have to say, given the sample size, it's a pretty impressive number of bisexual women. And again, none of the females identified as being a lesbian. All right, so to walk you through the procedure just briefly, participants started off by being asked to complete a brief demographic survey. So again, this is going to have a lot to do with the limitations of the software. So ideally, I would have loved to have given this after they had taken the IAT, but due to the way that the software worked, you had to start off in SurveyMonkey and then link to the IATs afterwards. So they were asked questions as far as age, sexual orientation, hormonal contraceptive use. For those participants who answered that they were currently taking it, we also looked at length of time on hormonal contraceptives, because females who have only been on it for 1 to 3 months generally are considered to not have had it taken full effect and therefore should be excluded. And we did actually have to exclude one participant because she had only been on it for 1 month. And then for the naturally cycling women, we asked about their average length of menstrual cycle as well as the date of last menstruation, and those last two were used to calculate the conception risk phase. And then of course you would then be redirected to the IATs, ideally. However, about half of the participants would then have the program crash, and they were able to fill out demographics and not complete the IATs. So it was very disappointing because you go through SurveyMonkey, and I actually did have lesbian participants, and I had transgendered participants. I had this wide sample, and because of the limitations of the software, it ended up actually not being able to complete for whatever reason. All right, so now let's go ahead and talk about the IATs individually. So the first one we're going to refer to is the reproductively relevant IAT. So the target categories for this were pregnant or not pregnant. So right now I should probably point out that a lot of previous research has looked at a lot of implicit measures of fertility cues. So having females wear shirts while they're in an ovulatory phase and having independent readers sniff them, like we just did in our project last semester. And other things such as taking photos of women who are in a high conception risk phase and having participants rate that. But I was actually interested in whether or not you could look at explicit cues of fertility. So in this case, we're going to look at fertility cues in the form of images. And for that, I wanted to look at women who are either very visibly pregnant and women who are not visibly pregnant. And so again, this is a very unique manipulation. And part of this study was also just to see if this would be an accurate manipulation used in the future. And given that we did find differences, I feel pretty safe saying that it was. So this might be something that future researchers want to kind of look into as an easy way to manipulate fertility cues for females. Another thing to note is that the images used were all the same 4 celebrities that I got from internet searches. Their heads were cropped off so that you would not be able to infer who the celebrity was. Additionally, I had an outside group come in and say that they did not know who the celebrity was, and also I had them rate whether or not the images belonged to the intended category. So all of the these images were rated as being pregnant, and all of these images were rated as being not visibly pregnant. And then we look at the attribute. So for attribute, again, we're going to use words because that's what's been used in all the other IATs. And so that's really just basically good or bad. And those are an example of the words. For the second IAT, the sexually relevant, basically we're looking at the same procedure except we're using different images. So images for this, basically previous research has shown that things such as sheer clothing, cleavage, tight clothing, bare skin displays are all seen as sexual cues. So therefore, I manipulated it so that half the stimuli were, again, in these provocative clothing, while half of them were in clothing that didn't reflect those characteristics. So looser fitting, no cleavage was exposed, and again, there were the bare skin displays were reduced dramatically. All right, so let's jump into the results. Basically, for analysis, we're going to look not only at significance values, but because I've gotten into a little bit of the debate about null hypothesis testing, I also wanted to look at estimated effect size in the form of Cohen's d. And then also because I wasn't only interested in the differences between women, I also wanted to see if there was an effect from the IAT at all. So we're also going to look at results in terms of IAT effect breakpoints. So whether or not they had a slight, moderate, or strong effect for the IAT. So hypothesis 1 was, to remind you, females who identify as heterosexual and are currently in a high conception risk phase will have the most positive attitudes towards the images of the pregnant targets. And that was not supported. Actually, what we found was very different. So again, I predicted that right there, the heterosexual females at a high conception risk were going to have the highest attitudes. And just to introduce you to the graph a little bit, I put the images in there to kind of make it a little more obvious. So scores higher to the top show a preference for the pregnant. Scores lower to the bottom show a preference for the not pregnant. So not only do we not see the heterosexual high conception risk females at the top of it, we actually see the low conception risk above them. And additionally, the highest score actually went to the bisexual high conception risk individuals, which is probably just an indicator that, again, just because your sexual preference maybe isn't heterosexual doesn't mean that you don't have an interest in reproducing, which is a rather obvious statement, but something that's been somewhat debated in the literature. And finally, something else just to point out is that we see a very dramatic effect here where the bisexual women who were on hormonal contraceptives had a very strong preference for the not pregnant females. And again, it was completely different from the heterosexual females on hormonal contraceptives who actually had a preference for the pregnant stimuli. So I'm not entirely sure how to interpret that, but it was definitely an interesting effect. So hypothesis 2 predicted that women who identify as bisexual are currently in a high conception risk phase will have the most positive ratings for the images of the sexy targets. Again, not supported. But we still find some interesting effects. So again, I predicted that these women that I have circled there were going to have the highest scores, and not only do they not have the highest scores, they actually have the highest scores in the direction of not sexy. And in actuality, we see that the heterosexual women at high conception risk have the highest scores for the sexy images. Again, something that was just contradictory to what the hypothesis was. And then finally, hypothesis 3. So basically, females who are taking hormonal contraceptives and women who are in a low conception risk will have similar scores compared to the high conception risk women. And it was supported. Yay! Got 1 out of 3. So as you can see here, basically the highlighted lines right here are going to be the women who are both low conception risk and hormonal contraceptive users. And you see that in general, they do tend to go in a similar direction, especially when compared to the high conception risk women who, especially in this first one with the reproductive relevance, it's going off in the absolute opposite direction. So that was the only hypothesis that was actually supported. Now, one other thing that I had that was approaching significance was that there was an effect for sexual orientation. So basically, heterosexual females showed this slight to moderate bisexual females approached this slight preference for the not pregnant stimuli, which again was nothing that was predicted, and I don't really have necessarily an explanation for why that is, and I'd love to hear feedback at the end about why anybody thinks that effect could have occurred. So to do a summary of all the other effects, because they weren't significant, there was not a significant difference between scores for females currently taking hormonal contraceptives or naturally cycling in a low or high conception risk phase. Not if you look at that and then add in a third level of currently taking hormonal contraceptives. And also there is not a significant interaction between the participant conception risk and their sexual orientation. However, I do want to just point you to some effect sizes, and for all transparency, I want to immediately draw attention to these horrible sample sizes here. So it's atrocious, and I know I probably shouldn't even be presenting them, but because it's my thesis, I'm gonna do it. So even though, again, we have only 2 participants here, which really is almost not worth even looking into, we do see very large effect sizes, and all that really can mean is that potentially future research could look in this direction and potentially find something if they were to, again, have the sample size necessary to really run these analyses. So again, something kind of interesting I just want to point out is that for hormonal contraceptive users, you see this really big effect where there's this huge difference for heterosexual and bisexual women. But then when you look at the sexually relevant IAT, there's no difference whatsoever. So again, I don't necessarily know what to make out of that. I don't know that you can draw that many conclusions given the sample size, but it's just something interesting to see that there is a really dramatic difference, especially for those hormonal contraceptive users. So limitations, number 1 was that unstable software. That really kind of limited the whole study. So that decreased the sample size and also, again, created a really unrepresentative sample because a lot of those participants who would have fit perfectly into the categories I was looking for whatever reason, their computer just could not run the software. And despite contacting the software people several times, they were never able to find a solution, so it was just one of those things we had to go with. Additionally, the methods for calculating ovulatory phase, as is true for most of these studies, if you're not taking biological specimens, you really don't know where a woman is at, and drawing any conclusions about whether or not she's fertile or ovulating is really impossible. So I would have loved to have had some type of other measure, but again, given the means and the scope of the project, it just wasn't realistic. And order effects. So as I mentioned, we had demographics first and then the IATs, and also additionally, the IATs always appeared in the same order because of the software. However, with that seeming like it should just completely null the whole findings, a lot of research shows that the IAT is actually robust enough of a test that doesn't actually have that huge of an effect. And in fact, participants who take IATs several times don't seem to show a decreased effect. So in that sense, the implicit association test is really awesome because it, again, ideally, I would have loved to counterbalance, but the fact that there were order effects is not going to totally negate the whole study. So future directions, I also collected data from males, so I really want to go through and analyze that. So I had done some preliminary analysis and found some very significant differences between females and males on their perceptions for each of the IATs. And additionally, I also want to look at relationship status because some previous studies have really found differences depending on where you are with a relationship. And finally, I would love to do this. I want to kind of recalculate ovulatory phase in a couple of different methods because there are so many out there right now, and really see if there's a difference between the results based on that, to really kind of also critique the way that we look at ovulatory phase in the literature. So the conclusions, again, we saw that hypothesis 1 wasn't supported because we had bisexual females in a high conception risk phase having the most positive attitudes towards pregnant stimuli, and the bisexual women having the most positive attitudes towards the not pregnant stimuli. Additionally, hypothesis 2, not supported. We see heterosexuals in a high conception risk phase having the most positive attitudes towards sexy, and bisexual females actually having the most positive attitudes towards not sexy. And of course, my one hypothesis of support, females in a low conception risk phase and females taking hormonal did perform similarly, so that is in support of that hypothesis. And I did go ahead and run t-tests to make sure that there wasn't a significant difference between those two groups, and there was not. So, and another way of putting those conclusions, let's see if this works.
We know what's under that.
It didn't start where it was supposed to, but.
So, we did some research, and turns out, people like pregnant.
Oh my God.
The bigger you are, the bigger your numbers.
I was surprised because I feel the opposite.
So I saw that the other day and it was just too perfect. So we don't know why Kristen Wiig didn't like the not pregnant, but maybe if she took the study, we could have had some more insight. So I want to, of course, acknowledge my thesis committee, Lynn, Tabitha, Alice. Thank you so much, especially for doing a 1-week turnaround on my thesis and making this happen before graduation. I, of course, want to thank the Evolutionary Psychology Lab for the last couple years and for always being there. I want to especially point out Rachel Carmen, my collaborator for life, and who has helped me so much over the last few years. I, of course, want to thank Sean, Jenna, Mike, and TJ as well. Thank you so much for coming. And hi, Mom and Dad. I want to thank you as well. All right. Thank you.
Questions from the non-thesis committee folks?
Right, not all at once, guys. Rebecca.
Went out of your way to cover everything already.
On one of your last slides where you were talking about like hypothesis 1, 2, and 3 and how like the results I think it was.
Mm-hmm.
For the first one, it's like so much information because there's so many variables. I feel like maybe like intersectional competition just because I'm obviously thinking about my thesis and that it seems like that would probably like lend support to why it came out that way. And maybe just because I know like about you like did a project I think on co-parenting or you were going to.
I mean, part of the initial thing that I wanted to look at with this thesis was intersexual competition. The further I got into it, the more it just wasn't really coming through, and the measures, again, weren't necessarily getting at that. So to stay on the safe side, I didn't try to make too many assumptions about intersexual competition. For those of you who don't know what intersexual competition is, that just means competition between females for mates. And yeah, I think you definitely have a point there. So again, if if women are, well, the first one doesn't necessarily, because again, you have based on hormonal contraceptive use. What was your thought there?
Well, because I was thinking, I don't know if it's like reaching too much, because I was thinking about the whole co-parenting and just the way we evolved and how we all took care of each other's children. So maybe if you're bisexual and you're in a high conception risk, then you're going to be reaching out to pregnant women for that social support.
So like an allo-parenting approach.
Yeah,